Because I hate myself, I've decided to do a round 2 where I quickly respond to Frank Turek's talking points. So buckle up.
How many different ways do you need to get to heaven is the question. Right. The reason Jesus is the only way is not because it's an arbitrary claim. Like he says, look, I'm the only way, you got to go through me. The reason he's the only way is because he's the only one that can solve the problem. Because he is innocent and he takes the punishment on himself for us. Everybody else is guilty. I can't take your punishment on me because I got to be punished myself. But he's an innocent human being who volunteers to take the sins of the world upon himself. So God remains just, and he allows the unjust there not to go punished or not to be punished because he's punished somebody else in our place.
It makes absolutely no sense whatsoever to say that a being remains just precisely because they allow the unjust not to be punished as a result of punishing an innocent instead. The only reason people entertain this is that it's emotionally satisfying to imagine a scapegoat can solve all your problems with a miracle of divine bookkeeping. And it's not just atheists who push back on this. As renowned philosopher of religion John Hick said, quote, "The idea that guilt can be removed from a wrongdoer by someone else being punished instead is morally grotesque. And if we put in what might at first sight seem a more favorable light by suggesting that God punished himself in the person of God the Son in order to be able justly to forgive human sinners, we are still dealing with the religious absurdity of a moral law that God can and must satisfy by punishing the innocent in place of the guilty." Unquote.
If I'm a detective and atheist Michael Shermer is a detective and we come on a dead body, and I say, okay, I'm looking at all the evidence here. I think candidate X did it. And Michael Shermer says, no, candidate X did it, or didn't do it. That's the wrong, he's not the murderer. And I say, okay, who is the murderer then? And he says, well, I just lack a belief that your guy's the murderer. Is he a good detective? No. Shooting down my suspect isn't enough. If he's a good detective, he has to give reasons as to why candidate Y is the murderer. Not just to say that your guy is the wrong guy. That's all I'm saying, Scott.
Now, I have some sympathy with what he's saying here because I am an atheist who makes the claim that God probably doesn't exist, and I'm fine giving reasons for why I believe that. I also think more activists should embrace this. However, burden of proof is largely context dependent.
Whoever makes the claim bears the burden. If you're accused of a crime, it's the district attorney's job to prove that you're guilty. It's not your job to prove that you're innocent. Basic concept. Everybody understands it.
So in everyday contexts where it's almost always religious people making claims at others, non-religious people don't owe you a fully fleshed out worldview in response to, say, the claim that they're going to hell forever unless they're washed in the blood of a dead apocalyptic prophet. You owe them a case for why on earth they should believe that. And eliminating your views as an option without providing an alternative is just as acceptable in those cases as it is for a defense team to poke holes in the prosecution's case without committing to another suspect. Further, I do think that positions making positive claims about the existence of entities that are not normally accessible do have a higher burden of proof in general. Imagine I go up to a person who believes fairies cause the grass to grow, and I say, your position doesn't make sense, and you shouldn't believe this. As the aggressor, I have set myself up to have a context-dependent burden of proof. However, that doesn't mean the fairy grass-growing position as a whole doesn't have a different burden than the more natural accounts.
How do you approach spreading God's word to someone who already hates God?
Wow. Why do you think they hate God?
I think that they think all the things wrong that happen in their life are God's fault and could be controlled if God loved them, and that they believe that God does not love them.
Okay, well, I would ask them, by what standard are they judging God? In other words, when you are saying that God, I'm assuming if you're angry at God, you believe he exists. Right?
I'd say so.
I would assume that the person believes God exists. So I would ask, by what standard are you saying that God is immoral if he doesn't give you what you want? Secondly, I would ask, what is the purpose of life? Is the purpose of life that God makes us comfortable and gives us everything we want here? Is that the purpose? Are we supposed to be God's pets, in other words?
Notice first that he couches this in terms of God not giving you what you want, when we have no idea what the background of the person in question is. They could have suffered tremendously as opposed to not getting the new Lambo they prayed for. Second, suppose I believe in an all-powerful, all-knowing deity who delights in ultimately bringing about as much suffering as possible. And by the way, because his nature grounds morality, that's totally cool for him to value. Someone objects that the world doesn't look anything like they would expect it to if that deity actually exists, and that the befuddling mix of good and ill we see around us suggests that if there is some kind of deity, he's indifferent. How does saying, "By what standard are you judging God?" help in this case? The claim is that certain observations are surprising on my hypothesis, and similarly, someone who believes in God but doesn't think he's loving, or at the very least doesn't believe he loves them, is using similar reasoning. Now, we could argue about whether this person is correct, but it doesn't seem right to drop the "by what standard" card unless we're positive that the person in question is making a moral claim. And in this case, I'm not sure they are. Even so, you don't need God for morality anyway, so check out the links in the description for more on that. Also, there's a wide chasm between a world where we're not God's pets and one where his presence is indistinguishable from non-existence. Even some believers are comfortable admitting that. Quote, "Nature, as many of us cannot help but see it now, no matter how much we may delight in its intricacies and beauties and dangers, is primarily an immense and mindless machine that generates poignantly ephemeral life out of a perpetual chaos of violence and death." Unquote. So that's it for now. But this is part 2 of my Frank Turek speed round series, so tap here for part 1.